Hi everybody, thank you for having me today. I'm Kristen Spencer. You can find me on the internet at Kristen Codes on Twitter. I'll be posting my slides there after today's talk. I'm also a teacher. I work at HackerU in Toronto. We're a coding school. We have part-time programs and a full-time bootcamp, which I teach. We take people who are new to the tech industry and we teach them the skills they need to land jobs as junior developers at companies in 9 weeks. So I'm here today to talk about training juniors, since that's kind of what I do every day. But not just training juniors. This was kind of the best talk title I could come up with. Naming talks is hard. It's very hard. It's the hardest part. But I want to talk about learning and mentorship in general and how we can kind of optimize that process and make it better for everyone. So I want to take a second to kind of take a step back. I'm going to share some quotes with you. And I want you to think about maybe who said this, if it was somebody kind of new to their career or somebody who had a little bit more experience. I have no idea what I'm doing. I've been really stuck on this one thing for like 2 days. I just learned X, and now it feels like I need to learn Y. Now, maybe turn it back on yourselves. Maybe you've had a thought like this in past recent history. I think it's pretty clear this is a trick question because it doesn't really matter what stage of your career. We all have to learn all the time in order to stay relevant in our jobs. And maybe the only thing that changes over time is that you just start to become more comfortable with that feeling of not knowing things. So if you are hiring in tech right now, you're probably pretty aware of the issue. There's a lot of juniors on the job market right now looking for work. People are entering our industry in high amounts because there's a lot of promise of learning to code and all the opportunities there, which there are, it's true. So people are coming out of computer science degrees, taking boot camps like the one I teach. They're self-taught, and they're making switches mid-career too. But everyone wants to hire the senior developers with a little bit more experience because we've got a product to build, there's work to do, and it just doesn't feel like there's the time in the day to dedicate a large amount of it to onboarding someone. So this is a problem, and the obvious solution is we need to kind of close the gap between how long it takes for somebody to join a company and be effectively contributing in a meaningful way. And I think we can fix this, and I'm going to talk about what I've learned in my experience on how to do that. But we need to realize that in order to solve this problem, mentorship and training people and valuing this is just as important a function of your role as a senior as writing code is. We need to make the time for this. So a lot of people who are coming into the tech industry now too are coming from underrepresented groups. And there's a lot of voices in your head when you don't see anyone who looks like you at your company that you don't actually belong there. So that in your head combined with the feeling of being new and being vulnerable, that can be altogether too much. So having an effective mentor who's empathetic and understands the whole process can be the difference between somebody ultimately leaving the industry or staying and being really successful and thriving. So I really think this stuff is important. So why am I here to talk to you about this? What do I know about it? Well, I teach for a living, so it's kind of on us to stay on top of things really quickly because our students benefit from us learning the best practices and the latest stuff all the time. And I also learned to code myself later in life after I had my first baby, so I didn't have a ton of spare time to be spending hacking around with things. I had to optimize my time too. So over the past couple years, I've become really obsessed with this idea of optimizing the learning process and using time really effectively. So I've done a lot of reading. We kind of treat HackerU's bootcamp as like a laboratory where we tweak variables constantly and see what works for people every time. We're always iterating on the way we deliver content. And I've come up with these kind of 4 principles that I like to follow that I've put together that I think can be really, really effective in onboarding a new person onto your company. So cut out the noise, repeat, value context, and have empathy. So I'm going to talk about all of these things and how you can hopefully apply them in your day-to-day. So here's my first one, cut out the noise. This is very similar to essentialism, which we just learned about. How do we reduce overwhelm to focus on what's important? So I read this book. It's The 4-Hour Chef. Has anyone read it? It's about cooking. and learning how to cook very quickly. But the larger thesis of the book is about rapid learning. And so Tim Ferriss is kind of this like famous life hacker. And he talks about language acquisition. I think he knows many languages. And he says in the book that you only really need about 100 words to be conversationally fluent in any language. You don't need to know every word. And further than that, he breaks down these 6 sentences that when translated, you can learn a lot about what you need to know about how verbs and pronouns work in the given language, how things are conjugated. He calls this the minimum effective dose. So isolating what's the most important material to study can be very, very effective. So can we apply this to code? What is the minimum effective dose of your code base or your application or whatever it is that you do? Can you identify the stuff that's going to give the learner the most context and have the highest impact on their learning? So in HackerU Bootcamp, we teach JavaScript, and we have a very short amount of time to do it. We also teach React, and students are introduced to React about 3 weeks after they learn JavaScript for the first time. So it is very rapid, it can be very overwhelming. We really need to make sure that we're isolating what is going to get them the most value so that we can achieve our end goal. The end goal is that students have 1 to 2 React projects in their portfolio that they feel confident about, that they feel like they can explain well. And JavaScript is a very large and overwhelming language at the beginning. So we have to really cut out the noise and make sure beyond the basics of this is an object, this is an array, what are the JavaScript fundamentals we can teach so that when they get into writing React components, they understand what they're doing a little bit better. So we focus on classes, the map method, async code, callbacks, how do callbacks work, immutability. These are some things that are going to come up when you write your first React component. They can learn about recursion later. There's a lot of time to deep dive into those topics, but we've kind of identified these as important things to focus on so that they have more context when they're moving on to a more complex framework like React. So you don't need to know everything. You don't. Just like it only needs you only need about 100 words to be conversationally fluent in a language, you can learn specific things about JavaScript and be able to write a working application. So that's a strength and a weakness. It's a strength because if you teach the right things, it can have great results and people can be building things more quickly. But it also means that there can be gaps in knowledge that you don't anticipate. So it's just important to think about that too when you have somebody coming on new. So here's the kind of practical application. So if you yourself are the learner, focus on the fundamentals because the fundamentals are going to get you further than any sort of abstracted thing. It's always going to help you out more when learning a framework. Look for patterns. If you see something happening over and over, make it your mission to figure out why that pattern is used. And then when you figure it out, try to explain it to somebody else because nothing will solidify your learning more. If you are the mentor, see if you can identify what the most important things to teach your person that you're onboarding about what it is that you do, whether you're building an application or something else. Ask your developer to explain things back to you. That way you can identify gaps in knowledge and make sure that you are speaking to those things as well. So my second principle is repetition. If you read any books on learning, this is something that comes up in every single one. And we have all these idioms: practice makes perfect, practice makes permanent. We can do our best to ourselves cut out the noise and say focus on these things, but the brain is still taking in things from all 5 senses all at once. So there's still a lot of overwhelm that's happening no matter what we do. So with repetition, we can start to identify patterns and move things from short-term memory to long-term memory. So here's another book recommendation, The Talent Code. This is by Daniel Coyle. And this book talks about how talent is, you're not born with talent. It only comes with deep practice. So by deep practice, he really means repetition among a couple other things. So if you practice something that is mediocre, that's what you're going to make permanent. So you want to make sure that you're always iterating on the process and getting a little bit better every time. So when you are learning, learn by doing. Make a ton of small projects. Do exercises over and over. When you learn more things, see if you can revisit those projects and do them again a little bit better each time. If you don't know where to start, there's a lot of repositories on GitHub with amazing ideas for small little JavaScript applications you can build, for example. Memorize syntax so that you can focus on logic. When I'm teaching JavaScript, I have my students write for loops over and over until they want to throw their computers at me. But the point is that I don't want them worrying about where to put the brackets. I want them thinking about what they want their code to do rather than how to actually construct it. So if you are mentoring, have frequent planned feedback on the schedule. This is really, really important so that as we are repeating things, we're getting better every time. A nice idea is to bring your dev into code reviews for other people. So you're going to be reviewing their code, but having them sit in on you reviewing someone else's code is a nice kind of like non-emotional, low-stakes way for them to see more examples, because the more examples, the better. And also identify patterns and ways that other people are doing things so they can actually absorb more information. Assign similar tasks at the beginning and let the brain figure out the pattern. So don't worry about being wildly interesting right away. It's better to have something small, discrete, and simple that they can move into the column of I've mastered this task and I feel confident before introducing too much all at once. So my third tip is to value context. So what this means is don't let yourself or someone else lose sight of the big picture of what we're doing. So I have a 4-year-old and he's learning to read right now. This is a picture of a book called Tough Guys Have Feelings Too. Great read, highly recommend it. So he's reading, we're doing bedtime stories with him, and my partner and I kind of were debating what the best way to help him along this process was. So he would make him sound out every single word on the page, and I, at the first hint of struggle, would just offer the word right away. Playing good cop is like, it's great. It's a great role to play. So we were on other sides of the spectrum when it came to how to help him effectively. So at parent-teacher interviews, we asked the teacher, like, how do we most effectively help him to learn how to read? And what she said was that the way they recommend it is sound out the first sound, look at the last letters and the last sound, look at the picture, make your best guess at what the word is, and if they struggle too much, then just give them the word and move on. And the idea around this is that learning to read is not just phonetically sounding out every word. It's also important to understand what word came before it, what word came after, how is this sentence coming together, and how is this sentence adding to the entire story. If you struggle too much over one word, you can get frustrated and lose context, and then you're kind of like missing the joy of reading and the joy of kind of the story in general. So this is important for code too. If you get too frustrated and stuck on a problem, you can lose sight of what you're actually trying to do in the first place. So you want to kind of protect this context of what are we actually trying to build here, or what is the problem I'm trying to solve with whatever task I'm doing right now. So when you are learning at the beginning, be easy on yourself. It's okay to look at other code and mimic what other people are doing to start before you start kind of coming up with your own ways of doing things. So, whether that's opening DevTools and seeing how somebody accomplished something in CSS, or looking at a code pen, or just looking on GitHub at how somebody did something, that's okay. That's how we learn. Find or make starter files. So my best example of this is like, you don't want to get caught up on the build tools. If you're learning React, don't spend time like on your Webpack file. That's just frustrating and it's besides the point. Create React app exists for a reason. Just use something like that to get up and running more quickly so you can focus on the material that you actually want to be learning. A lot of companies do pairing. This is, I think, great because it's a great way to keep the context of what's happening. If the newer person is in the driver's seat writing the code and there's somebody more senior there to give advice and provide context for them about what's happening, that is a really, really amazing practice that's pretty easy to implement. And again, keep the first few tasks clear and small in scope to avoid that frustration and make it very clear what somebody is going to be trying to accomplish. So my last point is, I think, the most important one, and it's to have empathy. I think it's frustrating for both the learner and the mentor, or it can be. When you're learning, it's really easy to tell yourself, maybe you just made a mistake, maybe programming isn't for you, you just don't have the brain for it when you're kind of stuck on a hard problem. But being a mentor can be frustrating at times too, and I think it's okay to acknowledge it. You can kind of forget what it's like to be new at something, and then it's frustrating to try to explain something that seems like a basic concept to you to someone else and have it not go very successfully. So I think that everybody needs to take a step back and think about other areas of their life where they were new, where they were a beginner, when they were maybe vulnerable, and try to kind of bring that mindset back to what they're doing. So here's some examples. If you've ever learned a new instrument, it's very hard and you suck at the beginning. It's terrible. I'm thinking about taking a recorder home in grade 4, just like a rough time for my parents, but like by the end of the year, I could whip out a tune. If you're starting a fitness journey maybe, so a lot of us have desk jobs and maybe every once in a while you think, I should start running, and then 30 seconds into it, you're already negotiating with yourself. You're like, oh, I heard this was bad for your knees anyways, and maybe I should just, cardio is stupid, it's not for me, and you're turning around and going back home. Dating somebody new, this is a different type of learning. You're learning how to interact with a new person, but that vulnerable feeling could be pretty similar to somebody like submitting their first pull request at a new company. It's kind of scary. So whether you are the learner or the mentor, just be kind to yourself and to others, and try to think about another area of your life where you were new, you kept at it, and then eventually it just didn't suck so bad. So just to recap, my 4 points are: cut out the noise, repeat, value context, have empathy for ourselves, for our fellow developers, because after all of us are learning all the time. That's why we do things like come to conferences. And we'll be well on our way to bridging the gap from being new and uncomfortable and not knowing what's up to being a confident, code-pushing, amazing developer on a dev team. Thank you.